Hi, everybody. Peter Greenberg here on our continuing series of reports on the global cruise industry. If you were looking to see where some of the real flashpoints were in the cruise industry over the last 14 months, you saw some of them, cruise ships being quarantined in Yokohama, other cruise ships being unable to unload their passengers in Florida. And then there was Australia. Australia had a similar problem with the government and with the cruise lines and with rules and protocols that are still being evolved. And in one particular situation, the government at one point even wanted to ban cruise ships entirely. It was a serious situation. Joining me now, Joel Katz, Managing Director of the Cruise Lines International Association in Australasia. I love that word, Australasia. Joel, we have a situation now, forgetting even the cruise lines, where Australia and New Zealand have effectively said, we're closed. We're not going to open until January of next year at the earliest. You have some flights operating in a bubble between the two countries with either Qantas or Air New Zealand. But if you're an Australian, you're not really flying anywhere. If you're a New Zealander, you're not really flying anywhere. And if you're a cruise ship passenger, you don't really have anywhere to go. So give me an idea of what you've been doing for the last 14 months, I suppose, to just get ready so that when you do start, you actually do have someplace to go.
Good to be with you, Peter. Yes, you're quite right. Both the Australian and the New Zealand governments took a very conservative approach from day one of the pandemic. So as early as March 2020, both countries shut their borders to the rest of the world, and effectively those borders remain closed. And as part of that, they also, while allowing the ships that were currently at sea at the time to disembark their passengers, they effectively excluded any international cruise ships from entering either Australia or New Zealand. So we've been working with the government since those very early days to try and encourage them to develop a pathway forward for cruise resumption, a framework that the industry can work under that would allow what we're initially calling for is a domestic cruise season carrying local passengers only on local cruises while those international borders remain closed.
Now, there are some cruises that started last year in Europe that were essentially cruises to nowhere. They just went out to sea and stayed at sea and came back. Are you actually going somewhere?
So we have no mainstream cruising operating at all in Australia and New Zealand. The biosecurity emergency, which is what the government is using to keep the borders closed, prohibits any ship of 100 or more passengers from entering the country. So we do have a couple of small locally flagged ships that are able to operate locally here in Australia, using exactly the same protocols that we're advocating for the broader industry, and really demonstrating to the government and to the states that it can work in a responsible way. So we're now calling on the government to really work with us to develop that framework that will allow some of those larger international ships to be able to come back into the, as you called it, Australian bubble, while the borders still remain closed, so that we can operate those domestic cruising within the borders.
My assumption is if you can do that successfully, it becomes your test case, if you will, and then that allows you to show that the government there that you can open that bubble.
Exactly, and as we've seen in other jurisdictions around, in Asia in particular, more than 120,000 passengers have successfully sailed in Singapore without a single positive COVID case on board the ships. And we're saying to the government, we can do that. We can do the same here, respecting the success that, to give them credit, both the New Zealand and Australia governments have been very successful in keeping COVID out of our country. So we can replicate that here, and we can responsibly resume sailing locally.
When you talk about the protocols that you have in place now, give me an idea of what they are.
So it's very much what we're seeing happening in other parts of the world, and in fact in our day-to-day lives. So apart from the industry's commitment, which is really goes beyond any other sector, with 100% testing of all passengers and crew. So that means nobody's getting on board a clear member cruise line here in Australia without a negative COVID test. And then once they get on board, it's really everything we're used to in our day-to-day lives here in Australia. So the social distancing, the capacity restrictions on venues, mask wearing where you can't social distance, and then of course all those other, I suppose you could say, back of house enhancements, the ventilation systems, the enhanced medical facilities, and of course, making sure that we've got the appropriate response plans in place.
And are you getting to the point now saying if you want to get on a ship, either now or when the bubble is lifted, the officer has to be vaccinated, the crew member has to be vaccinated, and the passenger has to be vaccinated?
Well, we're in a slightly different situation in this part of the world to what you're seeing in North America and in Europe, in that our vaccination program is actually much further back, I suppose, in the timeline. So we've really just started vaccinating. So what we're saying to the government, we're in a very fortunate position here. We don't have community transmission like you have in other parts of the world. So we believe that we can responsibly resume sailing with the negative COVID tests. And then as the vaccination rollout progresses, the vaccine will take a part in that broader mitigation measures.
I'm assuming in terms of physical infrastructure on the ships, you've done some design changes so that you've got separate quarantine areas, you've got separately, segregated areas for anybody who does test positive, and you have testing areas which you never had testing areas before.
Exactly, and just as we've seen in those successful resumptions in other parts of the world, what we're saying to the government here is that we would have the enhanced medical facilities on board, so enhanced medical crew, enhanced facilities, and then, as you described, the segregation of cabins, so that in the event we did have cases or suspected cases on board, they could be appropriately managed.
What's been your education through all this?
So, likewise, we're having to learn to deal with, areas of government that we haven't dealt with before. I think one of the lessons that we will take away is that we need to make sure that we're not only working with those that have a specific responsibility for crews, but that we're also working with the health teams to be prepared for these sort of, I suppose you could say, unexpected events that could occur. The other thing that I suppose has been reinforced by this is just how passionate our community is and how resilient our community is.
Joel, thanks so much.
Thank you, Peter.
Appreciate it. I'm Peter Greenberg. I'll see you next time on another edition of Global Cruise Report.